Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Dynasty Slant. This is Scott Spratt, and I'm joined, as always, by Michael Moore. We're both writers for PFF Fantasy, and this is your source if you want to hear Michael's and my thoughts for keeper and dynasty leagues. Well, Michael, today's a very special day because it is my 32nd birthday, which means that for the next 6 weeks, I am going to be older than NFL head coach Sean McVay, who now has 9 wins in his professional career. Michael, how should I feel about this?
I don't know, Scott, but that makes me feel worse since my birthday was about, 8 or 10 weeks ago. So thanks for that.
Oh, well, I'm sorry we missed that on the podcast, but happy belated birthday to us. And, maybe if we get it together in 2018, we can catch up with McVay. What do you think?
Well, that, and I feel like, I'm pretty good on franchise mode in Madden at 32, and okay. he's okay at running an NFL team at 32. So really, it's the same thing.
Yeah, I mean, that seems pretty equivalent to me. All right, let's jump into the topics then.
Oh my God, it's picked off!
Topic 6.
Michael, we have some quarterback-centric topics to at least kick off the top of the show. And I want to start with what's kind of a bit of a depressing one, which was that on Sunday there were a lot of quarterbacks that got hurt, probably most notably Carson Wentz, who looks like he tore his ACL and could miss the rest of the season for the presumed number 1 seed Eagles. In addition to that, we had Josh McCown, who broke his arm, and Marcus Mariota, who played every snap in the Tennessee loss, but he didn't look super good. He was playing through a knee injury, and he's really been banged up all season. So, Michael, let me ask you this. There are a lot of these younger guys in particular that seem to be getting hurt. Is there something to this? Is there like a reason that some of these younger quarterbacks are getting hurt? And what are your thoughts on what that does to their value in dynasty formats?
Well, as far as the topic of injuries go, Scott, I looked it up, and it's not just necessarily quarterbacks that are getting hurt a lot more. Like, for example, there was a story right after Deshaun Watson got hurt in Sports Illustrated, I think, that looked at the number of overall players on IR as of November 1st. And in 2017, that number was 295 players compared to only 252 players like that in 2013. So literally a 20% increase in 4 years. And again, that's all players, not just quarterbacks. So as far as what's causing that, I don't know. I mean, you've heard Drew Brees sort of complain a little bit that it was the Thursday games that contributed to that, or maybe it's the training camp. I don't know what the cause is, but I think it's pretty obvious that there is something to it as far as people getting hurt more often and probably for longer periods. Now, as far as quarterbacks go, it's kind of it's sort of like if everyone's getting hurt, then, you can't really get hurt yourself because one day either your quarterback will go down or your opponent's quarterback will go down. But that kind of goes back to my general feelings on Dynasty, which is a personal preference, but I always like to get the elite option and then at least get a starter as my backup for this reason, which is you never know when your quarterback's going to go down, and it seemingly is happening more often now.
That does seem to be true. I do wonder that the stat that you mentioned there about injured reserve is pretty interesting. I wonder if the boomerang may have an impact on that, because now that you can actually bring early season IR guys back, like maybe that's a roster flexibility decision to a certain extent. But either way, I mean, it definitely seems like there are a lot of quarterbacks getting hurt right now. I wanted to try to put some data to this, Michael. And so what I tried to look up here was sort of a stat that would represent how often quarterbacks are getting hit, so we could sort of compare different types of quarterbacks to each other. And the one that I settled on was anytime a quarterback got either sacked or hit by defensive pressure per dropback. And I actually did it per 100 dropbacks just to make it a little bit more readable. And it's not perfect. There are guys on both ends of this list that get hurt. But it does seem to me like the more often a quarterback allows himself to get hit, the more likely he is to get hurt. So let me read you some of the guys at the top of the list. I'm jumping around a little bit, but over the last 2 seasons, Cody Kessler is the number 1 guy, hurt. Robert Griffin III, obviously hurt, always hurt. Tom Savage got hurt last week. Matt Moore, several concussions over the last 2 years. We have Carson Palmer out for the year, Andrew Luck out for the year. Your boy Jimmy Garoppolo is coming up here, so we'll have to talk about him in a little bit. And there are guys here that get hit a lot that have avoided injuries, Jared Goff, Russell Wilson, for instance. But a lot of those guys are getting hurt. Carson Wentz is kind of on the tail end of that at 14.1 sacks and hits per 100 dropbacks. Most of the leaders there are up in the 18 and 19 range. So he's doing a little bit better job. Of course, he's also running with the ball. On the other end of the scale, we have guys like Kirk Cousins, Phillip Rivers, Jay Cutler, Blake Bortles, Dak Prescott, Tom Brady, Matthew Stafford, Andy Dalton, Alex Smith, Aaron Rodgers. Some of those guys have gotten hurt, Rodgers, for instance. But more often than not, it seems like those are the guys that are lasting 16 games. And it also seems like those guys are the veteran guys, too. And maybe it's a self-fulfilling prophecy where if you're staying healthy, that means you can have a long career. But I wonder whether the more experienced a quarterback gets, the more comfortable he is at reading pressure and understanding when he needs to get rid of the ball. And some of these younger quarterbacks maybe haven't figured that skill out yet. Do you think that stands to reason, Michael?
Yeah, I mean, the injured list you reeled off, I mean, it's 50-50, it seems like. Like, for example, for every Robert Griffin, you've got a Jared Goff, who admittedly has not played that long but has yet to get hurt, or Russell Wilson, for that matter, who has played a lot longer and yet to get hurt. So, I think it's fairly obvious that if you're getting hit more by a defense, the chances go up that one of those hits is going to be the cause of an injury. So, I think bottom line is protection of the quarterback is probably more important than ever now.
That's true, but I don't think that those lists were necessarily just about the offensive line quality. And it obviously wasn't just about whether a quarterback chooses to run with a ball or not. Those were only looking at dropbacks, so not looking at the choice to run. And I don't know, it seems like there was more youth on the getting hit list and more experience on the not getting hit list. And again, I don't really know what the order of events is, but I do think there might be something there. It really is a shame about Wentz. He's maybe the most exciting quarterback in the game today. I mean, he's definitely probably the number one dynasty guy before this happened, right?
Well, he was after Deshaun Watson was the most exciting player in the game, and then he went down. So,
I know.
And look, I also hope that this year has been a fluke, at least as far as devastating injuries to exciting young players. But look, the numbers don't lie. They're getting hurt more. And look, the hits are becoming more violent too. I mean, look at the Tom Savage hit yesterday. I mean, he had a literal seizure after one of his hits. So, yeah, it's a violent game. And I think unless the NFL, I'm not advocating this, but unless they do more to protect the quarterback, I don't know that trend is going to stop anytime soon.
It is unfortunate. So let's brighten our days a little bit to talk about your new favorite player, Jimmy Garoppolo, who is now 2-0 on the San Francisco 49ers and has been really impressive in getting there. He's thrown for 627 yards in those two victories. So, Michael, is Garoppolo the best quarterback this season or the best all time?
No, it's all time,
okay.
Which, and I'm not going to say that's hyperbole at all. In 2 games, he's had 2 positive PFF grades. Like, what else can I say? And they came against 2 extremely intimidating, stout defenses in the Texans and the Bears. So really, what else is there to say? But no, he's not the greatest quarterback of all time. He's not the greatest quarterback of the season. However, it is not an exaggeration to say he is the best quarterback the 49ers have had this season, and that's not even close. I mean, in his 2 games that he started anyway, he's had 2 positive PFF grades. Meanwhile, C.J. Beathard, 1 positive PFF graded game out of his 6 starts. Brian Hoyer, 1 positive PFF graded game out of his 5 starts. So already he's matched the number of positive performances, at least when it comes to our PFF graders. So, I think as a 49er fan, and this is, getting a little personal, at the very least, what this means is we do not have to spend a high pick on a quarterback. I think the trade that John Lynch made earlier this season was worth it. And look, we can now focus on getting a top-flight playmaker, whether it's on offense or defense, in the draft. And look, that evens open up the possibility of Saquon Barkley being there and drafting him to go with Garoppolo, which is very exciting. So, no. But as far as Garoppolo goes, I think he still needs probably a top-flight receiver to be in the quarterback 1 conversation. But I think this definitely helps his chances.
I'm going to circle back to a specific value in a minute. But when I was thinking about how I wanted to look into how good Garoppolo has been, I was trying to consider how you compare to some 49ers quarterbacks, which, that definitely undersells the type of player he's been this year. Obviously, he's a lot better than everybody on his team. So what I decided to do was look at other quarterbacks that have had good, fast starts to their NFL careers in recent seasons and compare Garoppolo's first 4 starts to those guys. And I have to say, Garoppolo stacks up really, really well. So over his first 4 games, and again, 2 of these were on the Patriots and now 2 on the 49ers, he threw for 1,123 yards, 8.7 yards per attempt, 5 touchdowns, and 2 interceptions. So just looking at by yardage, the only quarterback in recent seasons that I found that did more than that was Cam Newton, who threw for 1,386 in his rookie year. But Garoppolo threw a little bit higher yard per attempt at 8.7. Cam was at 8.5. The only quarterback near Garoppolo besides Newton in yards per attempt was Marcus Mariota at 8.7. Really, nobody else was above 8 yards per attempt, and even that with Deshaun Watson was really good. A lot of the guys like Andrew Luck, Kirk Cousins, and Aaron Rodgers were 7.5 and under. Plus, a lot of those guys threw more interceptions than touchdowns. So pretty much by all of these measures, Garoppolo has had the most or one of the 2 or 3 most successful starts to his career of any quarterback in the last decade or more. So it's 4 games. You probably don't want to get too carried away with it, but you can't really start any better than Garoppolo has started so far. So let's get into the specific value then. I pulled up a couple of guys that I might have been a little bit bullish on, but I'm using Scott Barrett's Dynasty quarterback rankings since he updated those just a few days ago. But do you prefer Garoppolo or Kirk Cousins in the long term?
I would probably still go Cousins, just because he's got a bit, a bit of a longer track record, obviously. But I think he's also going to end up at an offense, whether it's Washington or otherwise, that probably passes more than it runs, more likely than Garoppolo. So I'd say Cousins.
Okay. By the way, I started aggressive there. He's Scott Barrett's number 6 Dynasty quarterback. How about Garoppolo versus Deshaun Watson?
Look. Don't get me wrong, as a 49er fan, if he ends up being a top 5 fantasy quarterback, I will be extremely happy with that. Garoppolo or Winston or Watson?
Oh, I wrote Winston. Let's do Winston, because I noted that Winston was the 7th quarterback in Scott's rankings.
Oh, see, now this is where it starts to get tough, only because, I think Jameis Winston was probably a top 5 dynasty quarterback going into the season, but man, this season has been tough. And now there's talk of maybe Dirk Cutter, the coach, not being back next year and all sorts of stuff. So if I had to right now, and this may be me just being super optimistic, but I'd probably go Garoppolo at this point. I think Winston, I don't know, the turnovers are really starting to pile up. This season obviously has been not great. So I would probably go Garoppolo there.
I would too, but I think I would have Winston lower than 7th. What about Garoppolo or Jared Goff, who I think contractually obligated to include him in every quarterback dynasty ranking question?
Well, and this is a really tough one because you've got the quarterbacks under 2 really good offensive coaches in Shanahan and Sean McVay. So right now, I would probably go Goff. I think the foundation is probably a little better there, meaning he's got Gurley as opposed to Hyde, who may or may not be there next year. So I'd probably go Goff at that point.
Okay, interesting. It's a little bit tough to tell exactly where all these guys would shake out, but it sounds like you have Garoppolo as probably a back-end quarterback 1. Does that sound fair?
Yes, I would say that. And again, to me, that's still optimistic. For example, I was looking at previous Kyle Shanahan quarterbacks, and you've got Matt Ryan, who had Julio Jones. He had a very good offense, but if you look at the worst case quarterback that Shanahan had to work with, I would probably say that might have been Matt Schaub. And even he turned in a back-end quarterback 1 fantasy season. So I think Garoppolo is probably a better quarterback than Schaub. So yeah, long story short, I think back-end quarterback 1 is about right.
Shots fired at Matt Schaub, man.
Hey, look, I don't think Matt Schaub's complaining. I think he had his best seasons under Shanahan and probably earned him a lot of money. So I don't think he would take that as a slight at all.
I don't know for sure, but I bet Schaub earned quite a bit of money in his NFL career. All right, let's talk about another quarterback that may be a back-end quarterback 1 in Dynasty, but I'm really not sure, and that's Derek Carr. So unfortunately for the Raiders, they lost to the Chiefs on Sunday, which more or less eliminates them from playoff contention. Last year, it seemed like this really big breakout year for Carr, and everybody was talking about him as sort of the young dynasty quarterback to own before Wentz had arrived and everything else. But at this point, I'm really not sure what to make of him. Michael, did you know that Carr has the same yards per attempt each of the last 3 seasons at 7.0? So what do you make of that? Was he worse last year than we thought? Is he better this year than we think? Or is it sort of somewhere in between?
Well, and I know you and I both looked up using our PFF stats, not to plug the PFF stats, but we did. For me, I got to pin this on the receivers, I think. I mean, if you look at the receivers and how they did year over year, it's pretty different. Like, for example, you had Amari Cooper, who's, his troubles have been very notable this season. But, for example, did you know he's dropped 20% of his catchable passes this year? That's
yes.
not an exaggeration. 20%.
No, literally 20%. That's 1 in 5 for people keeping score at home.
Right. Whereas last year, he was only dropping about 5% of passes last year, of catchable passes. So that right there is a big reason why. The same numbers, Crabtree, he's dropping 11% this year, 13% last year. So Crabtree, to me, is still the same player. But Cooper, that number was very striking to me. But then if you look at like PFF grades, none of his receivers are doing well at all. Like Cordarrelle Patterson is literally his highest rated PFF receiver this year at 49th. Crabtree's at 76. Cooper is our 97th highest rated receiver. And Seth Roberts, bringing up the rear, is dead last at 116, whereas Cooper was our 22nd rated receiver last year. So, and I know you're going to point out some numbers that were very similar for Carr, but when you look at the receivers, they're just very different from last year. So to me, this is on the receivers more than anything.
So as soon as I thought of this as a topic, that was the first thing that came to my mind, was that clearly their wide receivers are dropping balls and that's causing the problems. And that's absolutely true. They are dropping the balls. He's got 33 drop passes that he's thrown this season, and that's the most in the league. But what I was surprised to learn was that last year, Carr also led the league with 37 of his passes being dropped. It wasn't all Cooper last year the way it has been this year, but it was still a huge problem for the Raiders, and it was something that really hurt Derek Carr's numbers in particular. But even when you make the adjustments for that, it's not like Carr suddenly becomes an elite passer. I looked up yards per completion, which kind of takes that out of the mix. And over the last 3 years, he's had 11.4, 11.0, and 11.0 yards per completion. So it's the same this year as last year. And that's not in the top 20 in the league, either of those two seasons. So even if you sort of take that out of the mix, unless you're saying that somehow like the receivers are just still doing a bad job, maybe they're not getting those yards after the contact or yards after the catch or anything like that, I still think it's a lot lower than I expected it to be. Do you have any other thoughts, Michael, about this?
Well, and sort of touching on the dropped passes, one more note on that. His deep ball completion percentage is also way down from last year. So last year it was 51.8%. So literally half of his deep balls, 20 yards or more, were caught, whereas this year it's only 35%. So he went from 1 and 2 to 1 and 3 of those passes being caught. A lot of them, like you mentioned, by Cooper. And then another thing, though, that really isn't on the receivers, at least not entirely. His quarterback rating last year under pressure was 70, whereas this year it's a 43 rating under pressure. So for whatever reason, from this year to last year, vice versa, Carr's doing a lot worse with pressure. And it's not like he's got a bad offensive line. The Raiders actually grade out very well when it comes to pass blocking. So I don't know if the receivers are just letting him down when he's under pressure or what, but it seems like if he had, a couple more balls caught this year, whether it's by Cooper or even Crabtree, his numbers might look a lot different, at least from the touchdown category, than they do from last year.
Shoot, I was trying to find a stat on this because I had looked it up relative to another quarterback, and I noticed that each of the last 2 years, Carr has the lowest pressure percentage of any quarterback. So even though his like actual performance has changed kind of markedly by rate on pressured passes, he doesn't get pressured very much. So that's not really a huge chunk of what he's doing overall. I think that might not be the full story either. And I've kept looking for things to kind of explain differences, and it's like his accuracy percentage is pretty much the same, 73.9% last year, 74% this year. The running backs have gotten a little bit worse, dropping from 4.4 yards per attempt to 4.1. That's maybe costing them about 5 carries and 30 rushing yards a game, but so much of it's the same. And even the defense was similarly bad last year, so I'm not entirely sure why the record was so much different. And that kind of creates a mystery. Like, I don't really know what to think about Carr as a dynasty quarterback. So I guess maybe the best thing to do is to throw out some more comparables for you, Michael. Do you think you prefer Carr in dynasty formats or Matthew Stafford?
If Calvin Johnson magically walked through that door tomorrow and re-signed with the Lions and started to play again, I'd say Stafford, but I'd still go Carr. I still like his weapons around him more than Stafford, and he's got 3 years, like you mentioned.
Yeah. So Carr's 26 years old. Matthew Stafford is 29, which is a pretty big difference. And for the record, Stafford is 15th in Scott Barrett's Dynasty quarterback rankings. All right, Carr or my boy Jared Goff?
Oh, your boy.
Okay.
All day.
Nice.
Oh, yeah.
By the way, Goff has 8.1 yards per attempt this season, so that's a full yard better than Carr's best season / every season at this point. What about Carr or Jimmy Garoppolo?
Oh, man. Why do you do this to me?
You're allowed to say Garoppolo because I'm pretty sure I would.
Really? You would say Garoppolo?
I
Interesting.
would. Yes.
At this point, I'm still going to say Carr, but it really is contingent on what San Francisco does as far as receiver goes this offseason. Like if they draft, a guy in the first or second round, or maybe they sign a free agent. So for right now, I'm going to say Carr, but I will reserve the right to change that here pretty soon.
Totally fair. All right, that's enough quarterback talk for today. So let's shift to talk about a few other interesting topics that came up this week. And the first of those relates to running backs, and specifically from the Cowboys-Giants game on Sunday. These teams, neither one were working with their typical normal starters, but they had a couple of running backs who had a lot of receiving production, seemingly out of nowhere, at least from my perspective. For the Cowboys, you had Rod Smith with 5 catches for 113 yards and 1 touchdown. For the Giants, you had Wayne Gallman, the rookie, 7 catches for 40 yards on 9 targets. Michael, do these specific receiving performances change how you think about either of these players in the long term?
Quite honestly, no. For example, with Smith, I mean, it's hard to gauge how involved he's going to be when Elliott is there. Because look, a lot of this stuff is coming without Elliott there, and it's just hard to say what the role he's going to have is when Elliott comes back and is a 3-down back. Like, for example, Elliott led all Cowboys running backs last year in targets with 39. The year before, when Darren McFadden was the lead back there, he led all Cowboys running backs in targets with 53. So they're not a team that uses sort of the passing down back a whole lot. They use a 3-down back quite a bit. So, it's hard for me to put a lot of stock in Smith, at least until we see how he plays with Elliott. As far as Gallman goes, I think the Giants running situation is probably one of the worst in the league. There's not a lot of depth there. They had Orleans Darkwa take a lot of carries. Paul Perkins was pretty bad this season. It seems like it's more a war of attrition there with Gallman. And I don't, I know he's seeing a lot of run later, late in the season now, but I can't imagine him being the starter next year for them.
Yeah, I think you were onto something there talking about the 3-down back with Elliott and the Cowboys. So Rod Smith, 4 of his 5 catches this week came on 3rd down. So he's sort of being used as a 3rd down back right now. But I agree with you that I think that role kind of goes away as soon as Elliott's back because he's just a better runner in general. Also, Smith, a lot of his yardage came on one 81-yard touchdown reception that he caught. I think he was maybe 10 yards down the field when he caught the ball, and he was behind the defense at that point. So once he had that catch, it was all done. With Gallman, he's kind of the opposite of Smith, where all 7 of his catches came on early downs, 1st or 2nd down, and Vereen even had 2 targets and a catch on 3rd down. So he was getting that early down work, and I thought it was really weird that he was getting the ball that much. I think it's just a case where the Giants just don't really have a lot of receiving options right now, and he was sort of taking what was given for him there. But Gallman has performed a little bit better than I expected this year. In particular, he's got 16.7 avoided tackles per 100 carries. That's the 16th best among the 76 backs with 50-plus carries this season. So he's been a little bit less plotty than I guess I thought he was coming out of Clemson. And he did have 20 to 24 catches a year at Clemson for over 3 seasons. So, he's got a little bit of versatility. But I think this is still pretty much a situation where the Giants don't have a lot of other good options, and I could see a pretty much total makeover for this team starting next season. So I'm not sure how heavily I want to invest in either of these guys, Michael. Do you have either of them that you're dying to own in Dynasty right now?
No, I think best case scenario for Gallman is he sort of fills that Shane Vereen role that he's had the last couple of years with the Giants, meaning the true passing down back. But I got to believe they go after somebody, whether it's in free agency or the draft, to handle the 1st and 2nd down duties.
And I don't think the third down duty really fits Gallman's skill set either. Like, he's kind of a weird hybrid in between being an early down back and a later down back. So I don't really know. It might be tough for him to carve out a role long term to make him a worthy dynasty own. All right, Michael, speaking of dynasty running back situations, what do you make of the whole Buccaneers running back situation? So last week, Doug Martin was out, and Peyton Barber had a surprisingly effective fantasy day, I think built on a couple of touchdowns. But this week, Martin was back, and those two kind of split carries. How do you see this backfield shaking out over the long term?
Yeah, when I was writing the notes down for this, Scott, I'll be honest, I just put in the poop emoji and just left it at that.
Yeah, that's fair. What's the digital version of that? How do you say that out loud? Yeah.
Well, I'm sure we could get some sound effects for that, and that would work. But
I could.
No, I think it. And Doug Martin has been so interesting because he's had very good years fantasy wise, and real life wise, and then he's had some really bad years. And it was a bit of a head scratcher even when they signed him a couple years ago, because a lot of people thought, oh, people don't spend money or teams don't spend money on the position anymore. But they did, and I got to believe they've come to to regret that decision ever since they did it. So he hasn't been great, and then anyone that they throw out there, whether he was injured or whether he was suspended, whether it was Peyton Barber or Jacquizz Rodgers or whomsoever, just hasn't exactly blown the doors off. So, yeah, but the interesting part is, I don't know that that's going to be their biggest concern this offseason.
Well,
it seems like they have a lot of issues. Yeah,
they do. But for fantasy owners, it may be their biggest concern, which is why I thought it was a worthy topic. You mentioned the contract, before the 2016 season, so a year and a half ago, he signed a 5-year contract. But Michael, it was kind of one of those fake contracts, if you know what I mean, where like it was reported to be worth up to $40 whatever million. But he's already gotten paid all of the guarantees on that contract. So I'm pretty sure the Bucs could cut him any of the next 3 seasons and be fine with it. And frankly, I would be kind of surprised if they didn't cut him this offseason, because I don't really feel like he's worth paying that much. I've kind of mentioned the avoided tackles per 100 carry stat. Martin is at 3.9 this season. That's the worst among all running backs. So he is just not getting it done out there. Some of their backups, like Peyton Barber, he's been a lot better than that at 9.2 avoided tackles per 100 carries. That's still not great, but at least he has some size at 225 pounds. It's not like Jacquizz Rodgers, who I just don't think could hold up over the long term. But yeah, I feel like Martin's on the way out. And Barber's a little intriguing. He's a second-year player who was undrafted out of Auburn. He's 23 years old, so he's young. He's playing the best out of the backs on the team, I guess. But if you made me guess, I don't think they actually have their primary ball carrier next year on their roster yet. I don't know if it's going to be a draft thing or if it's going to be somebody they pick up in free agency, but I feel like they're going to make a move. Do you feel that way too?
Oh, yeah. And, I don't even know if the head coach is going to be there next year, Dirk Cutter. I mean, he could be out too, which completely blows that thing up and looks for a complete makeover, even including Winston. I mean, he's had his troubles, and essentially it is a dumpster fire, and you should just avoid it until we get some clarity on it next season.
Well, they'll definitely try to salvage what they have going in the passing game. I mean, they'll fire coaches and offensive coordinators and everything like that before they move on from Winston. And I think that could bounce back. They have a lot of talent between Winston and Evans, your guy Chris Godwin, who we mentioned last week, who led their team in receiving this week. So another great stash by you and stash of the week. They have a lot of talent. O.J. Howard, too. I mean, they have a lot of receiving talent. Running back, not so much. So I think they'll be making changes there and probably elsewhere this offseason. All right, Michael, we've got one more topic to discuss in the topic 6, and that is my boy, Devin Funchess. I'm bringing Funchess up. He didn't have like a monster day necessarily in the Panthers win over the Vikings, 3 catches for 59 yards and 1 touchdown. But he did that against Xavier Rhodes, who was graded out as one of the best corners in PFF grades this season. And I just wanted to mention that Funchess has kind of taken off ever since the team traded Kelvin Benjamin. He's been a top 10 receiver in Dynasty PPR points per game since week 9, which is when they made that trade. So I guess I'm going to ask you, Michael, like how far up your Dynasty rankings has Funchess climbed? Has he become like a wide receiver 2 for you? Like what do you think is going on here in Carolina?
Yeah, I think a low-end wide receiver 2 is probably about right. I mean, he's Fantasy's 15th ranked receiver right now. And again, we've talked about receivers this season before. You've had some injuries. You've got, Josh Gordon, for example, who missed most of the season. So, 15th isn't exactly where he probably will end up if everyone were healthy. But, right now, low-end wide receiver 2, I think, is fine. He's the number 1 receiver on that team. I can't imagine them spending a lot of money or using a high draft pick on sort of a stud receiver to overtake that. So, and he's done well. Like you said, he's done a lot better without Benjamin there. So it's not a matter of, him not seeing a team's top corner or top secondary. He's drawing that top corner now, and he's still performing well. So as long as he is the top receiver in Carolina, I think a low-end wide receiver 2 is where I'm comfortable with him. And look, I'll be honest, I was not a fan before, but that's also before they made the moves that they did, whether it was Benjamin, whether it was, drafting McCaffrey that high. And look, the other factor here is Greg Olsen is getting older, and we don't know how much time he has left. So that's going to open up even more targets for a guy like Funchess.
That's true, but the opposite perspective on that would be the fact that Olsen has been out all of this year, and since the team didn't really plan to not have Curtis Samuel and not have Kelvin Benjamin for the season, have these things sort of conspired to give Funchess more work than he would expect to have going forward? Even if the Panthers don't pick up a premier outside receiver, if they have a healthy Olsen next year, if they have some kind of deep threat, maybe Samuel, maybe whatever, does that chip away at his value and kind of move him back into more flex range?
Well, I think the benefit of having the whole season next year without Benjamin there, I think will help. And yes, you did mention Samuel, but, I don't know that Samuel's necessarily going to be groomed, if you will, for that sort of top receiver role. He's going to be more in the short to intermediate game, a la McCaffrey. So, I would still be comfortable with Funchess as sort of that low end wide receiver 2, which would be, as far as dynasty rankings go, probably low 20s, maybe mid 20s, something like that.
Yeah, I'm going to ask you a specific question there in a second, but I just wanted to mention that I was sort of playing devil's advocate there because I have been super impressed with Funchess so far this season. He's kind of a similar player to Benjamin, in particular with his size. He's 6'5" and 230 pounds, and he can't really run like Benjamin couldn't. But he gets open. Like Benjamin couldn't get open. He was great at making catches, contested catches while being covered, but I feel like Funchess actually can run a route tree and can get open. I was kind of joking as I was watching the Panthers game with my friends over the weekend. Cam threw a back shoulder pass that Funchess made a catch on, and I think it's the first time I've ever seen Cam even attempt that throw, never mind be successful with it. I think it kind of is showing you that Funchess is sort of getting to that level where has a sophisticated understanding of the offense and can make those sort of reads and adjustments. Looks like a real receiver, not just like a big guy. So I am optimistic about his value and agree with you that he probably belongs in the 20 to 25 range at the position. But let's see if we can put a number on that specifically, because I noticed that Scott Barrett had Funchess down at the number 37 wide receiver in Dynasty. And again, the timing of the update could influence that a little bit because Benjamin had only just been traded, but let's compare some other guys that he has on the list. Do you think Funchess or Michael Crabtree is more valuable going forward?
I definitely think Funchess there. I mean, not the age aside, which Funchess, has a lot on. His catch rate or his drop rate is only 5%, meaning he's only dropping 1 in 20 catchable passes, whereas Crabtree, like we mentioned before, is up around, 10, 11, 13%. So, to me, I would take Funchess, especially in dynasty formats.
What about Funchess or Dez Bryant?
Oh, man. And that, we could probably spend a whole episode talking about Dez Bryant and what what his value is in dynasty leagues going forward, because he's had quite the roller coaster. But I would probably, oh, man. You know what? I might go Funchess, actually, which surprises even myself.
I would, too. I feel like at their peaks, they aren't going to be the same player. Obviously, their peaks don't coincide. But right now, I feel like they kind of are the same player, where Bryant doesn't really have the same separation ability that he used to have. So they're both now very good physical receivers that are going to score a lot of touchdowns. Give me the youth there.
Like you said, he's 23 years old. I mean, he's doing all of this while still being extremely young, which means he has a lot of good years ahead.
All right, let's move on to Gunpoint Banner.
Guys.
Gunpoint Banter.
Michael, I think this may be our most frustrating, difficult gunpoint banner question of all time. And this was your call, so this is your fault, basically. Who is your number one dynasty wide receiver, Michael?
Well, and to be fair, and to issue a kind of disclaimer, I think you and I both decided we could go back and forth on this pretty easily. But I will make the case for Antonio Brown, who, when you visit a lot of dynasty sites or look at rankings, doesn't typically take the number one spot because he's so much older than the guys like Beckham or Mike Evans. And look, that's fair. He's 29 years old, so he'll be 30 next season. But I don't know that you can discount his production enough to warrant that. I mean, he's had just a crazy stretch since 2011 as far as receivers go. Like, for example, in that stretch, he's number one in receptions. Number one in receptions with 616. The next closest, by the way, in receptions over that same time span is 528 by Brandon Marshall. So a whole 90 receptions more over the 6 seasons. Yardage-wise, he's also number one with 8,210, which is a whole 8% more than the second highest, which is Julio Jones and 7,610. So, and I get it. I get the age thing, but when you compare just how productive Brown has been, and I don't know how else to describe Antonio Brown. There's not enough positive adjectives to describe him, but he's just so far and away better than the other receivers and more consistent than maybe all of one, which you'll get to in a second. I have no problem ranking him as my number one dynasty receiver.
I certainly don't have a problem with it either, Michael, but I did go with Odell Beckham. And at first I was sort of blinded by how gaudy Brown's total numbers were, like the raw totals. But I decided that I wanted to look at this by looking at their production per game. And in part, that's because obviously Beckham is missing this entire season. But Brown has been remarkably healthy over that 5-year run, which has helped him pile up the 1,500 to 1,800 or whatever total yards in the seasons. But if you look at it on a per game level, Beckham hasn't been extremely far behind Brown on a per game basis. So Brown's averaging 11 targets per game. Beckham's averaging 10. Brown's averaging 106 yards. Beckham is getting 93, so maybe 12 short. Beckham's getting a little bit more touchdown production. If you kind of combine it up into PPR points per game, Brown is at 22.6 and Beckham is at 20.6. So over an entire fantasy season, that's 30 points. 30's a lot, but what is that 4 years worth? The 4 years that Beckham is younger than Brown. Would you sacrifice, say, 50 expected fantasy points over the next 3 seasons if you could get back that 3 times over from Beckham in the 2020s? I don't think there's necessarily a right answer to that. I think it might depend on the nature of your dynasty roster that you have, but I feel like the long-term value that Beckham is going to provide you over Brown can bridge the gap, which is why that sort of in a neutral team context, I would probably lean Beckham over Brown, but it's super close.
Yeah, and like we said, I don't know that there's a wrong answer between those two. I think you could say definitively those two are it. I think there's serious red flags with anyone else behind them, but with those two, I mean, and just some other numbers on Beckham. So his first 3 seasons, he had 288 receptions. That's the most for any receiver amongst their first 3 seasons since the merger. His 4,100 yards is second most as far as any receiver goes in their first 3 seasons. And then his 35 touchdowns is third. So you're truly dealing with I don't think it's a stretch to say a generational talent in Beckham, but like you said, it's a matter of what's your priority. Are you thinking 5 to 7 years down the road, or are you saying, hey, I need to win in the next 3 or 4 years? Because if you're saying 3 or 4 years, I think Brown is a safer choice. But if you're thinking, hey, I'm in this truly for the long haul, then I could see taking Beckham over that. But yeah, both are extremely good. And the other interesting thing that they both have in common is both are going to face question marks at quarterback here in the next season or two.
That's true.
Because you got the Giants, who, depending on who you believe, are going to be looking at quarterbacks here pretty soon. And then you've got Roethlisberger, who's perpetually threatening to retire. So those two things could throw a wrench in all this. But as it stands now, I think both are worthy of the top spot for sure.
I agree. I did actually consider a couple of other options there. I didn't consider Evans. I have seen Evans ranked in the top 3 in a lot of dynasty rankings, but I think he hasn't been good enough this year to justify that. I did consider Julio Jones. I ruled him out because he just doesn't really get the red zone productivity of these other guys. And I did consider DeAndre Hopkins, and I thought really hard about it because Deshaun Watson looks really, really good. And so that gives him potentially the quarterback answer that those other two guys have. But it wasn't enough to me to bridge the difference in production those guys had shown in recent seasons. So that's kind of what I settled on.
And I would agree with you. To me, I think Hopkins, to me anyway, would be third for the point that you just made, which is his quarterback situation is probably the best out of any of these receivers that are at this top tier. So, but yeah, they're all good. I mean, if you have one, then you're in a pretty good spot.
Absolutely. All right, let's close this up with the stash of the week.
I'm telling you, these shares. Yeah, that sounds like a good idea. It's definitely a good idea. Dwayne, I get it. Now, can you get me? Have I ever lied to you? That's right. And ask around. I never do, Dwayne.
Stash of the week.
I already mentioned how Michael's stash of the week from last week, Chris Godwin, led the Buccaneers in receiving yards this last week. So, Michael, what do you have to answer that great pick from a week ago?
Well, I'm going to go with tight end Adam Shaheen from the Chicago Bears. He also had a good game this last week. 4 receptions, 44 yards, and a touchdown. His best game of his very brief career so far. But as far as the stash goes, I don't know that he, is on a lot of dynasty rosters, at least depending on how big your rosters are. So I think now's a good time to get him because his pedigree is pretty good. He was drafted in the second round this year to sort of be paired with Trubisky, who the Bears obviously took second overall. And he's got a clear-cut path to starting next year. You've got, obviously, Zach Miller, who suffered a very gruesome injury, and who knows when he will be back. You've got Deion Sims, also on the Bears roster, but his contract is probably going to be prohibitive, so he probably is going to get cut. So I really think Shaheen is going to be a lot more involved next year from the get-go. And I think he's probably available in a lot of dynasty leagues. So that would be my stash this week.
That's a good pick there, Michael. I'm going to choose a similar type of guy here, but one that might be available in even deeper formats. And that's Steven Anderson, tight end for the Houston Texans. So Anderson was actually a wide receiver at college at Cal. He's only 6'2", and he's kind of bulked up to get to 230 pounds. That's still pretty undersized for at least an NFL tight end, even though that's a giant person in real life. But Anderson that means that he's kind of got the route tree developed, like in some of those wide receiver instincts that you like to see, but will have the positional eligibility to be a tight end. So I think that could potentially really work out nicely for fantasy owners. The reason he's getting this opportunity so quickly in the league is because CJ Fedorowicz, unfortunately, may be forced to retire because of concussions, which kind of opens the door for Anderson to get playing time. He's actually had 18 targets over the last 2 games. Again, Houston doesn't have a lot of other options there, but Anderson has been productive so far. So I think he's a guy that I want to look at in some deeper formats and hope that he's out there running routes constantly. Maybe a little bit like Ricky Seals-Jones, where you get that tight end eligibility, but he's being used more like a wide receiver. Maybe he can parlay that into being a top 25 or so dynasty tight end next year. We'll see. All right, Michael, that's going to do it for today's episode of the Dynasty Slant. Thanks, everybody, for listening and hopefully subscribing. We're part of the PFF Fantasy Specialty podcasts that include the IDP and DFS shows, so check out those other shows as well, and we'll look forward to talking to everybody again next week.